Today on Inside Utah Politics, municipal elections are fast approaching. Hear what's at stake this November in the elections that so many overlook. And a shakeup on Utah's High Court. We've got expert analysis looking at what's next after one of the 5 justices leaves at the end of the year. And the big, beautiful bill hits the Senate, but it looks like it has a bumpy road. Hear what changes lawmakers, including Senator Mike Lee, are already considering.
Time now for Inside Utah Politics with Lindsay Aerts.
Well, thank you for joining us today. I am Lindsay Aerts. Let's go inside Utah politics. We begin our program looking ahead to Election Day and the races that hit closest to home. That's right, we're talking about municipal elections because those happen this year. Towns and cities across the state will elect new leadership with no statewide or federal candidates on the ballot. And that fact can lead many voters to skip out. But there's a lot at stake when you take a closer look. So joining me today to explain it all, we have Kyle Friant. He's the executive director of the governing group. They're a local political action committee. Kyle, thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me, Lindsay.
Okay, so make your pitch. Local elections, it's where the rubber meets the road on things that get done. The federal delegation, they don't fix your potholes, right?
100%. Well, it's so true, and it's also a great opportunity to have your vote really count because, as you noted, the turnout in these elections can often be as low as 20-30% of registered voters actually showing up to vote in a municipal election. And so quite literally, your vote can be the difference. We've seen municipal races decided by 1, 2, 21 votes. And so not only is this where the rubber hits the road, you're also able to make your impact felt the most because many of your neighbors aren't even showing up.
That's a really good point. So your vote always matters, but when fewer people are voting, yeah, it matters a lot. Okay, so there are 253 cities and towns in Utah, so we are not going to hit every single municipal election, but we wanted to hit some of the highlights of these and kind of talk about them in these themes that we're seeing. And the first one is growth. We know that Utah is growing, but there are some communities who are growing faster and have more either land or just ability to grow. And so there are elections in a couple of these cities. The first one is Vineyard. So talk to us about the mayor's race, who's running and why that one's so important.
You know, Vineyard, many people don't know this, at the last census was the fastest growing city in the country, not just in Utah, in the country. They're facing all these issues around infrastructure and housing, and how do you address that? And how do we keep the small town feel while also recognizing that Utah's continuing to grow and we need to find ways for that growth? And so you have a really interesting race for mayor between an incumbent city councilwoman, Marty Cifuentes, is running for mayor, and she's running against Zach Stratton, a local businessman and the son of Senator Kevin Stratton. And this really becomes an interesting referendum on how do you tackle growth within these cities. You kind of have Zach taking a very kind of aggressive approach about, hey, we need to really look very quickly at things like Utah City and the development that's happening to Vineyard. A lot of residents are saying, let's hit the brakes, and he's really very sympathetic to those arguments. On the other hand, you have Marty, who's taking a bit more of a measured approach, saying, you know, this growth is happening, let's deal with it in the best way, but let's not halt it entirely. And you really have 2 very engaged camps in Vineyard who've engaged on things like a new city hall that recently there was a referendum around that. So it's an interesting city that is one of the fastest growing, not only in the state and the country, and you have 2 mayoral candidates with 2 very different visions for how to deal with that growth, while also trying to get community buy-in from 2 very divided groups.
Take us up to Salt Lake County and Riverton. Mayor Trent Stagg stepping down after a long time. He's a very well-known mayor. Yes. So who's vying to replace him, and why does this fall in this growth category? I mean, this is another one of those fast-growing cities.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at the southwest area of Salt Lake County, so much of the areas that people are most familiar with, like Salt Lake City, are really kind of grown out and developed quite extensively. But in areas like Riverton, you have a mayoral race to replace Trent Stagg, who, like you noted, has run for U.S. Senate, has run for Salt Lake County mayor, now has a job in the Trump administration, a very well-known person. But you have 3 city council members vying to replace him. All have sort of communicated very similarly around the issue of growth and development and these sorts of issues. Obviously, there are nuances within it. It really comes down to Riverton voters to decide, how are we going to decide when you have very similar visions, what sort of biography do we want? So you have Tish Baroker, who's on the city council now, Fortune 500 company vice president in the past in her career, running, really talking about getting the details in Riverton. You have Tani McKay, the wife of Senator Dan McKay, who has been on the council for the past 7 years. She's really talking about connecting the community. And then you have Troy McDougall, who also has been on the council for several years, who references some of the same themes. He's been a seminary teacher, a local small businessman, and so three very similar visions in one sense, but three very different biographies, and it's up to the voters of Riverton to decide who's going to take the baton and run with it in one of the fastest growing communities in Salt Lake County.
Okay, so some communities are dealing with sort of what we're calling a referendum on local decision making, right? These are current incumbents who maybe are being challenged in a way because people maybe either don't like or just want to change in direction. So you have that happening in Provo, you have that happening in St. George, both in their mayor's races, also in the St. George Council. So talk to us about this Provo race first.
Yeah, so in Provo, you have a really interesting race, and on paper, a lot of political insiders will say this is an interesting race because the incumbent mayor, Michelle Kaufusi, she ran with John Huntsman as his lieutenant governor candidate in 2020, known as pretty a mainstream Republican, running against Marcia Judkins, a former state representative, also a Republican, also a known kind of moderate mainstream voice. It really comes down to, do Provo voters feel that after 2 terms, Mayor Kaufusi deserves a 3rd term? A lot of great things happening in Provo, the Provo airport expansion, a grocery store coming over to the west side. But former state representative Judkins is saying, look, the west side has often been abandoned in these decision making. 8 years is a long time to have a mayor. We need a fresh approach. And so it will be a really interesting race between 2 people who on paper seem very similar on policy matters, but who have very different ideas about Provo. You have Mayor Kaufusi saying, let's continue the momentum. And then Marcia Judkins is really saying, we need to elevate Provo. We need to go beyond where we're at right now. And it will be interesting to see where Provo voters land in that one.
Yeah, so interesting. Okay, this 3rd category, ranked choice voting. We know that many of these cities, right, this is why we're talking about it today, had their filing deadlines end this week. But there are other cities, just a couple of them, Midvale and Salt Lake City, that will have ranked choice voting elections, which don't file until August. So even though these are a few ways off, there are some interesting kind of dynamics shaping up in both Midvale and Salt Lake City.
Well, as you noted, the Utah State Legislature did not renew the pilot program for ranked choice voting, and so this will be the last year, very possibly, that Utah sees this alternative voting method, or really an alternative voting method entirely. Salt Lake City, our capital city, is one of 4 cities that still has ranked choice voting, and so that filing will be in August, but we're also already seeing some really interesting races, 4 city council races. One for District 5 represents part of the ballpark neighborhood in Salt Lake City, and as many people might remember, it's the Bees have now moved to South Jordan, so you've got this big location in Salt Lake City where there's really going to be a kind of a referendum in this council election on what do we do with this really big area that has been kind of an iconic part of Salt Lake City going forward. And so that race will be a really interesting one as we get ahead of filing. And then over in Midvale, you have Mayor Dustin Gettle is running for re-election. He won in a special election to replace the resigning mayor in December, actually kind of based off of a coin toss because there was a tie in the first round. And so that will be a fascinating race to watch. Midvale, an up-and-coming city in Utah, will be interesting to see if they vote to retain their mayor in the RCV election.
This will be so fun to watch. Do y'all see why Kyle is an election savant? Because you just did that whole thing without notes. So we appreciate your expertise. Thank you so much for breaking all these down. Is there anything else we're missing in terms of how people can find more information if they want to, like, how do they look up who's running in their city?
You know, city council, like you said, it's where the rubber meets the road. People want to be responsive. Often, as opposed to legislative races, people will have their personal cell phone number on their website. Go to their website, ask questions, go to town hall meetings. This is really your opportunity to make your voice heard and have your impact, not just in voting, but throughout the process. So show up, and if you really like a candidate, volunteer for their campaign, knock on some doors, get to know your community members better. It's really a great way to engage in the process. And really, where national politics is so nasty sometimes it's nice to get reacquainted as neighbors, get to know each other better, and care about the issues that actually matter more so than the national dialogue.
And we should point out these are nonpartisan races.
100% nonpartisan races, and so everyone will get the same ballot as opposed to a primary election in in a legislative race or a statewide race, and so it really is an opportunity to find some neighbors who maybe you disagree on national issues, but maybe you like the same person for mayor, and you can come together and find some common ground. Kyle
Friant, appreciate your time today. Thank you so much for all of those insights. You're with the governing group, so people can go look you up there. Appreciate it.
Thanks.
Well, still ahead on Inside Utah Politics, the Utah Supreme Court is soon to be down a justice. What that means for the High Court as it comes under pressure from state lawmakers.
You're watching Inside Utah Politics with Lindsay Aerts.
Well, Utah's Supreme Court Associate Chief Justice John A. Pearce plans to resign from the court. That happened this week. Justice Pearce says he plans to return to private practice after December 1st of this year. He served on the Supreme Court for nearly a decade, being appointed by Governor Gary Herbert back in December of 2015. Now, following his departure, Governor Cox will appoint Justice Pearce's successor, at which point the governor will have appointed the majority of the court's sitting justices. Well, I'm joined today by Matthew Burbank. He's a professor of political science at the University of Utah. Professor Burbank, thank you for being here to really walk through the impacts of this and what it means. Having a vacancy on the court is pretty rare in Utah Supreme Court. So just tell me first the most significant thing you thought when you heard that Chief Justice Pearce was stepping down.
Well, again, it's unusual because we only have 5 members of the Supreme Court, and so we don't get a lot of resignations. And he is somebody who has been on the court for a while, but he is not a very long-term member. So it was a little bit of a surprise to see him choose to end his time on the Supreme Court.
Talk to me a little bit about the history of the court here and just kind of like how unique is it for a justice not to seek another decade, right? They serve 10-year terms, right? So
Right.
How unique is that?
Again, what we've had on our Supreme Court here is a reasonable amount of turnover, not a huge amount of turnover, but a reasonable amount. That is, we have some justices who have been on the court for a number of years, Supreme Court. The Chief Justice, for example, has been on there, I think, 25 years now. But others have been on there 3 or 5 or 7 years, something like that. So, again, there's some range there. And again, with Justice Pearce, it was something that was, again, he was about at the 10-year mark. So.
Yeah. Now he says, like we mentioned, he'll go back to private practice, but it is no secret this comes amid the tensions with the legislature, right? As
Right.
the court and the legislature, the High Court in particular, has come out with some rulings this past summer, Amendments A, Amendments D, initiatives, the Utah Fits All scholarship, just some really serious issues. And there are more coming down the pike in terms of abortion and in terms of the Utah Fits All ruling, redistricting, things like that. So this is a really significant vacancy. Will you just talk to me about the process going forward and how we pick a successor?
So the way the process works is there is a nominating commission, and they get applications from people who are qualified. And what they're doing is they're really screening those applications. So they're looking for people who meet the qualifications, and that then what they're going to do is send names to the governor. So they send, I think, a list of 7 names to the governor, and the governor is going to pick one of those people, nominate them, and that nomination then goes to the Senate, the Utah State Senate. The Senate has a committee that works on judicial nominations, and they will have hearings and then vote. And if that person is confirmed, then they go on the Supreme Court.
So how do you suspect that Governor Cox might approach this pick amid these tensions that we mentioned, and I mentioned this amid this 7-member panel, right? Who has to, or the 7 members that get, that pick this person, and then there's also like how much can he really shape the court at this point?
Again, governors, because of the nomination power, are in a powerful position. He is the one person who gets to kind of decide who the nominee is going to be. Again, subject to the confirmation by the Senate, but he's really the person who gets to make that choice. What I think will happen this year is, because of those tensions that have been going on, we'll see the governor will be keenly aware of that. He's going to use the same process that he always uses, which is to look, of course, at their judicial qualifications, their experience, what they would bring to the court, all those kinds of things, which are just always part of that process. Again, there aren't very many to get picked, so it's a pretty selective process. But I think, in addition, what you're going to see is the governor thinking about is there anything about this particular nominee who's going to attract undue attention or negative attention from members of the Senate? And so that's the sort of thing where I think we're likely to see probably some more political consideration there because of those tensions, because we've had this legislative session which had all these bills that were about making changes to the judicial branch. And one of the things that came out of that, right, was, again, some unhappiness between the legislature and the judiciary. And the governor had to play referee there a little bit. And so I think what that means is he's going to be keenly aware of that as he makes this nomination.
Do you see the Senate really nitpicking here with this person because of those things?
It's entirely possible. It is a sort of thing which, if there are questions that members of the Senate have, they will undoubtedly show up in the hearing, right? So, and that will really be their opportunity to raise those kinds of concerns. Again, one thing about Utah is unlike, say, Supreme Court nominations at the national level, the process has not been politicized in the same way. That really the focus has been upon kind of judicial qualifications, your approach to the job, all those sorts of things. Again, I think because of those tensions this year, senators are going to be more keenly aware of that. They'll probably ask more detailed questions. They'll probably ask more hypothetical questions that judges will not be all that keen on wanting to try to answer.
Well, and it's almost like Governor Cox has a limited pool anyways, right? Because you have to apply, and then of those that apply, there's 7 people picked, right? So how much can he really influence it?
That's right. Again, he doesn't have an unlimited range. He can't just pick out anybody who he thinks might be great at this job. But on the other hand, again, he is in a position to sort of look at these nominees carefully, to talk to them individually, and to make that decision. And again, I think making the decision thinking, I want somebody who's going to be confirmed by the Senate. I want somebody who's going to be seen as being a strong, competent juror, justice of the Supreme Court, and not somebody who there's going to be questions about, did they do that, would they do this, any of those sorts of things.
Can you speak at all to the leanings of the current court and sort of how it might shift in any sort of way? Is there a leaning to the Supreme Court right now?
Again, I mean, what we've seen recently, is, as you mentioned earlier, is there have been a number of decisions that members of the state legislature have been unhappy with, but I don't think that's because of the leanings of the court.
I mean, they were all appointed by Republicans, whether it was Herbert or Cox.
They were all appointed by Republicans. They were all approved by a Republican Senate.
Yeah.
So it isn't as if there's some big surprise or something different happened, or there's some, political change going on there. So I don't think that has been the case with the court. I do think that what the court has to do, however, is they have to make decisions based upon what are the facts in this case, what's the law say, what's the Constitution say. So that's really their job. And again, there is some interpretation there. And so what they're trying always to do is to make decisions that make the most sense given the circumstances of the case, but also help to set a precedent. Again, that's one of the roles of the Supreme Court, right, is to set a precedent for saying, and in the future, this is how these decisions should be made. So they're keenly aware of that. I think, again, some of the things that the legislature has done really were problems that lots of legal observers would look at and say, this is going to run into problems, right? Courts are going to have a problem with this. The legislature tended to sort of ignore that. They didn't really want to hear it. And so I think that's one of the reasons is, again, if you're looking for why did this come about, it's at least as much the legislature's fault as it is any decisions by the court, I would say.
In our last 30 seconds, can you do some speculating for me on what other changes to maybe even the High Court or the courts in general you think might be coming from the legislature? I do know, and I have reported on the fact that they want to tweak that, appointing the Chief Justice, having the governor appoint the Chief Justice. So that is one we are watching for. Right,
and that's something which, again, they passed that bill, the governor vetoed it, and so that's one that you're likely to see come back again because, again, it got through the legislature last time. It wasn't something that died in a committee, and so I think it's something that they could come back to. Again, what the governor did was provide a very detailed veto statement that said, here are the objections I have to this, and it wasn't so much the governor appointing the Chief Justice, it was more that this would be done every 4 years.
Yeah.
And again, that's something that's in current law at the moment.
So change that from 4 years to 10 years and you've got my support, or 8 years, right?
That's right.
Yeah.
In some way that might make that a little, so that it's not just a constant process of reviewing Supreme Court justices, because again, that would, I think, tend to politicize the position a little bit more even the members of the legislature or the governor would like to see.
Interesting. We will watch and see how this all plays out. We've got some time to watch it all play out. Matthew Burbank, he's a professor of political science at the University of Utah. Thank you so much for your time today. Well, coming up on Inside Utah Politics, the big, beautiful bill faces its tallest test, the Senate. Why the president's budget plan is getting a chilly reception in the upper chamber. Stay with us. Senate Republicans are working to pass the president's budget bill, but it's got an uphill battle with a handful of lawmakers who disagree with the level of cuts. Washington correspondent Maddie Beer-Temple reports on the push to pass the bill and the opposition.
President Donald Trump is pushing Congress to pass his, quote, big beautiful bill by the 4th of July. It extends tax cuts while cutting funding for Medicaid by adding work requirements. It also raises the debt ceiling, a deal breaker for Kentucky Republican Senator Rand Paul.
I can't in good conscience give up every principle that I stand for. That's that we can't accumulate more debt.
The president posted about Paul, writing, quote, he loves voting no on everything. He thinks it's good politics, but it's not.
Well, I would say that's not actually true. I would say that I've been pretty consistent.
The Congressional Budget Office estimates the bill would add more than $2 trillion to the deficit over 10 years. The White House pushed back on the CBO report.
This is an institution in our country that has become partisan and political.
Even Elon Musk called the spending bill a disgusting abomination.
The bill passed in the House last month by one vote, with all Democrats voting against it. Now Senate Democrats are following suit.
Tax breaks for the ultra wealthy, paid for by gutting health care for millions of Americans.
North Carolina Republican Senator Tom Tillis is concerned about rolling back clean energy tax credits.
If we're not careful, the only people who will be happy with the outcome will be China.
But Senate GOP leaders are optimistic the bill will eventually get 51 votes and deliver on the president's agenda.
We will not fail. We will bring forward from the Senate a robust product that will protect the American people.
In Washington, I'm Maddie Beer-Temple.
Maddie, thank you. Now, Politico is reporting that Utah Senator Mike Lee has his own edits in mind for the big, beautiful bill, including re-adding canceled plans to fund the government by selling public land in Utah. Now, we asked Lee's office about these reports, and they tell us, in part, quote, Senator Lee remains committed to advancing Western priorities and ensuring that those who live closest to the land have a voice in how it's managed. Now, environmental groups like the Southern Utah Wilderness Alliance, though, have voiced opposition to these plans. Well, with Utah House Majority Leader Jefferson Moss leaving the legislature to run the governor's Office of Economic Opportunity, the House Majority has now elected new leadership. It's something of a shakeup here. Majority Whip Carrie-Ann Lissadby is out, and former Assistant Whip Casey Snyder is now Majority Leader. And two new faces have joined the representatives. Candice Perucci and Bridger Bolender will now serve as Majority Whip and Assistant Whip, respectively. Well, we now know who will lead the newly formed Government Records Office. The governor has tapped Lonnie Pearson for the job. He's worked as a lawyer for the Utah Attorney General's office, advising the state's top law enforcement official on how to respond to public records requests. Now, Pearson still needs Senate confirmation, but the new office was established this year by the legislature, replacing the 7-member State Records Committee that previously handled these issues. Now, critics argue this change could exacerbate a backlog of public records denials, while supporters say it brings trained experience to interpreting public records laws. Well, that's going to do it for today's Inside Utah Politics. Don't forget, if you have any local political stories you'd like to see, make sure you reach out to me. You can email InsideUtahPolitics@abc4.com. You can also follow along with me on social media. I'm on X, Blue Sky, Threads, Instagram. Just search for Lindsay on air, and Lindsay spelled with an A. Our show is also online in podcast form, so wherever you podcast, just search for Inside Utah Politics with Lindsay Aerts. Well, thanks for being with us, everyone, and we will see you next week.